Welcome back after this short break on behalf of RegHorizon and ETH Zurich Center for Law and Economics to the second AI Policy Conference. I guess most of you have followed the previous panel, but for those who are joining now, my name is Sanja Fabrio. I'm a co-founder and managing director of RegHorizon, and I will be moderator for this panel. So for the next 1.5 hours, we will discuss the soft law and how the soft law is actually an AI policy option. That is how to use the standards, the guidelines, the principles, and other voluntary programs to increase the effectiveness of AI governance while fostering the acceptance of AI technologies. In relation to the previous panel, we were talking about the regulatory initiatives, often referred to as hard law. While there is an important reflection going on and relevant regulation is about to be enacted, we also hear about some of its limitations, and we heard about some of them also in a previous discussion, where regulating systems are developing too fast. Regulations and laws cannot be made fast enough and in a flexible enough manner to address systems that are continuously changing and are destined to diverse applications. So this is where well-managed soft law options should come in to encourage innovation and growth while simultaneously protecting consumers and the civil society in general. The question is how they can be integrated in a legal framework that we're actually putting up together. But the criticisms over soft law we've heard include lack of oversight, lack of public support, as well as bias toward industry, often missing a weak mechanism to strengthen the effectiveness and credibility. And we're going to be talking about some of that as well. History, though, is with us, pointing to successful technology developments, often in the modern world, through creation, promotion of international standards, industry codes, and government certifications. Standards as a part of a soft law toolbox help in turn develop trust through clear definitions, best practice sharing, transparency, and very often the proof of compliance, such as certifications. So we will focus on this role of soft law in the AI governance and discuss the best ways to integrate effectively soft law initiatives into governance frameworks to stimulate responsible innovation and uphold trust or trustworthy agents of AI development and deployment. So today I'm here joined with a great panel of policymakers, expert practitioners, scholars to discuss the topic, and they will give us their views on some of the guiding questions that we will start with, after which we will open the floor to your Q&A. Our moderator, Paulina, will then bring them to the panel attention. And if we have more time, obviously, we will continue with another focus area, which is going to be also how to make these incentives and essentially link it a little bit back to the panel 2 questions that may have remained a little bit open. So let me introduce the panel. We have with us Thomas Schneider, Ambassador and Director of International Affairs at the Swiss Federal Office of Communication. Since 2020, he's the Vice Chair of OECD's Committee for Digital Economy Policy and Vice Chair of the Council of Europe's Steering Committee on Media and Information Society, as well as a member of the Bureau of Council of Europe's Ad Hoc Committee on Artificial Intelligence, or CAHI. Robert Madelin, Chairman of FIPRA. Robert was also European Commission's Director General for Communication Networks, Content and Technology, known as DigiConnect, as well as Director General for Health and Consumer Policy, SANCO. Robert co-authored several publications discussing the regulatory toolbox on AI and the most effective ways to address these AI in the AI governance. And we're going to come back to that. Carlos Ignacio Gutierrez, the Governance of AI Fellow at Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law at Arizona State University. Carlos is also Vice Chair of the IIAS Policy Committee at IEEE in Washington, D.C. His research interests focus on examining the soft and hard law approaches employed by government and non-government stakeholders in the management of AI and its effects on society. Emelie Bratt, a lead standards development manager at BSI, British Standards Institution. Emelie leads standard development in a variety of subject areas with a focus on emerging technologies. Her current portfolio includes coordinating UK priorities as well as managing national committee contributions to international standards on AI, quantum computing, trustworthy software, and more. Marta Janczarski, project editor for ISO IEC for 2001, AI Management System. She also recently worked as AI and data advisor on behalf of Standards Council of Canada for Canadian innovators for industry, academia, as well as the public sector. Karen Silverman, CEO and founder at the Cantellus Group. Karen is advising leaders in business and government how to better oversee and manage the AI and other frontier technologies. Karen is also a member of AI Global Council at World Economic Forum. Gerhard Andrey, member of the National Council in Swiss Parliament for the Green Party of Canton of Fribourg. Gerhard is also an entrepreneur in IT, a co-founder of LIP Digital Agency. And then we have Zhiyu Li, assistant professor in law and policy in Durham Law School, Center of Chinese Law and Policy. So welcome all. It's a really great pleasure to have you here. I will start with you, Carlos. You have co-led a project at University of Arizona that attempted to compile and analyze the existing soft law initiatives. We are actually building on the discussion we had in the previous panel, but also on the recommendations from our last year's conference that was saying that governments need to consider combining both hard and soft law approaches. So can you tell us a little bit more about the findings and recommendations of the publication that you put together, as well as what are kind of the key takeaways in this whole sphere?
Of course, Sanja, thank you so much for the introduction and for the invitation to this panel. To disambiguate, the definition that we use for soft law is any program that creates substantive expectations that are not directly enforceable by government. This means any type of programs, such as the ones you mentioned, private standards, guidelines, best practices. The main characteristic of this program is that it can be created by anybody, amended at any time, and adopted by any institution, which makes it an extremely flexible tool for any institution to manage artificial intelligence methods and applications. Now, of course, there's the downside. In order for it to be effective, there has to be an alignment of incentives. And because of the flexibility of this tool at Arizona State University, we wanted to understand and examine how it is being used throughout the world. You know, soft law is a great tool either as a first approach, as a second approach if hard law doesn't exist. In the end, its flexibility allows it to be the most common form of AI governance, just because of how easy it is to be created and amended. So indeed, we began this project that is divided into 3 parts, but I'm just going to talk about the second part, which is about how soft law and AI is being used today. And we identified throughout a year and a half over 634 programs that are soft law, that are any of the varieties that we discussed. It is one of the databases with the largest number of principles. We found over 150 of them, 150 sets of principles. But we also found recommendations, best practices, among other things. And there are a couple of characteristics that are really interesting to highlight. The first one is that soft law is generally thought of as industry self-regulation, as a means of private sector entities to create these organizational guidelines or standards to rule their own behavior. But what we found, which is incredibly interesting, is that the stakeholder that created the most amount of soft law in our database was government. So 36% of all of the soft law programs were led or created by government units. And this can be in the form of many ways. It can be national strategies. It can be enforcement guidelines for agencies that are, for example, in the United States, the FTC of the FDA, telling industries, hey, this is what we're thinking. Do something this way or hard law will come. So that is very interesting. And then the second thing that we found, which is a weakness of soft law, is that only 30% of the instruments that we found created or publicly displays enforcement mechanisms. And this is a little bit sad because it means that 70% of the programs that are out there are created and are not, the institutions, organizations are not thinking, how do we implement this? How do we make sure that in the future, this is used by the individuals or the organizations that we're targeting. And this is a difficult problem to resolve. What we found in our research, because we looked at the past, present, and future of soft law, when we look back at how other industries have used soft law for emerging technologies, we found the 3 incentives that any organization should consider when creating soft law. The first incentive is soft law being used as a government warning system. So governments come in and they create enforcement guidelines, they create communiques, they tell society, hey, we are thinking that this is the way that something should be done. If you don't do it, we will create hard law. That creates an incentive by organizations to do something about this communique, this issue, because they want to avoid hard law. The second incentive is private sector avoidance of hard law. So even before the government says anything, private sector entities create through their industry associations soft law mechanisms in order to avoid any government action. There's many examples of this in the past. For example, the video game industry created the ESRB, which is a rating system for video games. And this was because in the United States, there were many discussions of First Amendment rights, etc. So they created these instruments to avoid government interference. And this has also been happening in the AI soft law community. And the last one, the very last incentive in order for soft law to be enforceable is self-interest. And self-interest takes the form in many ways. The first one is, for instance, to avoid having a judgment, a public judgment against the institution. They create something to improve their reputation, to manage the goodwill expectations of their consumers. So maybe they implement a certification for toys, for AI toys, and avoiding how the vulnerabilities that can happen with children, compiling that information and using them for marketing purposes. So a toy company can say, hey, look, parents, we are protecting the information of your consumer, of your child, buy from us. Or they can implement private sector standards to minimize the liability that they have. So if a company does something incorrect because of XYZ, and if they go to court and say, hey, look, we might have done something wrong, but we implemented the best standards that are available from various standard setting institutions such as IEEE, BSI, or any other organization. We did the best that we could. And even though we made a mistake, we implemented these best standards. Then the court can say, oh, you know what? You did mess up. But because you implemented the best standards, at least you tried your best. It wasn't as if you were doing nothing to protect consumers. So these mechanisms such as private sector standards or guidelines or any other soft law program can help private sector institutions and also nonprofits to protect their self-interest and serve as a mechanism to implement these programs. Now, soft law is not the be-all, end-all. We, Gary Marchant and I, realized that it is topic related, or it's field related where soft law is most effective. So soft law can be very effective in some areas and maybe not in others, but we are not fundamentalists. We believe that soft law is extremely flexible and it can be used in any sector. And I'm going to post the links to our research in the chat. So anybody that desires to look at it can go in. And the very last thing I'll say, because I want to be sensitive to our time, is that one of the things that we did, we not only identified these soft law programs, we classified the text within these programs with 98 themes. So if anybody wants to go into this database and find soft law related to law enforcement or to privacy or to autonomous weapon systems, we categorized all that information. If they want to see the debates on who is accountable, an organization or an individual, we have that there. And the whole purpose of our work was that if any institution wants to create soft law, it is incredibly difficult to identify what is out there. There's just so many things out there, and we experience that with over 600 programs. So this database allows institutions to say, hey, if we want to create soft law on a particular subject, we can identify it through this database, and we can either create it on our own based on this, or just copy everything that we want from other institutions that have done it better than us.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Carlos. This is a really amazing tool. And it's so much needed, as you say, because we are actually now turning into efforts to link so many initiatives and to make sure that we don't reinvent the wheel, but actually can build on what is already being prepared. So thank you so much. And thanks especially for the incentives, because I think this is something that we're going to be coming back to as well, making sure that some of these reinforcements is actually being reflected in linking the hard law, so to say, to an effective soft law. So, Robert, if I may turn to you for the next question, which links in a way to what Carlos was just explaining. You are a long-standing European regulator, as well as chairman of FIPRA. You have co-authored several expert recommendations, among which on smart governance. The answer, I would say, that the acronym stands for is scalable, modular, adaptable, reflective, and technologically savvy. We would obviously love to see all these attributes in an effective governance that stays relevant and evolves with the regulation. So in such a type of governance, what would be the role of the soft law? And also, if you can share your views on how will the soft law complement the approach that EU AI Act is outlining?
So thanks very much. And I can't remember, because I skipped from seminar to seminar, whether you would allow me to share a slide. But I think my message, picking up on what Carlos is saying, is that firstly, I've lived my whole professional career fighting people who think that they're soft and hard and they're different. And I think that there are some really great examples. And if you allow, I'd like to quote three, one from the EU itself, one from the UK, and one from Switzerland, showing how in practice, the models that blend together hard law framing and enabling soft regulation are out there. And the problem that we have is simply one of, I would say, the political will to scale, because it's too easy for corporate boards and elected politicians to revert to old-fashioned command and control regulatory models. And so, since I'll take silence to
please do. I'm sure you're going to be
share. Let me just share this screen with you. There we go. Share. And so 2 years ago, we regulated in record time a small thing, which is the relationship of transparency between mega platforms in the internet and their users. And the first point about this, therefore, is it's hard law. It's a regulation. It's the top form of secondary legislation in the EU legal order. And it's the blue bit, the law framing the use of a toolbox. The toolbox includes hard and soft. Companies shall have a code of conduct. They shall create alternative dispute resolution. The state, or the commission in this case, will fund and maintain independent real-time monitoring, independent ongoing analysis of what is going on. Is the code of conduct working? Is ADR working or not? And the piece which is still not as strong as I would like in the EU legal order, fast rulemaking to fix problems. If you add to that the deliberative piece, which is in the top of the slide, i.e. meta-regulatory networks, so that we're not pretending AI is completely different, but AI is everywhere. So a telecoms regulator, a consumer goods regulator, a data regulator, they all need to understand AI. Let's help them to understand it in the same way. You create a future-proof landscape which has hard law framing to drive effectively, picking up Carlos's description of defective soft law, to drive effective soft law execution. And I think that, although it's a quite small example, shows that it's not rocket science, but you have to have clever people doing the drafting and you have to give them space to implement it. And I think that in a way, if I then go to the UK example and I talk about incentives, there's a very, I think, powerful model come out of the legal department of Oxford University called Ethical Business Practice and Regulation. And I can share a link after this. Professor Chris Hodges is the guy who's leading this. And we actually have, if anybody wants to join in, an international network for the development of regulation, which tries to push this. So what it says is companies need to do certain basic right things. Regulators should be able to get enough data to identify the small percentage of companies who either don't do it well or don't do it at all, and concentrate the limited tax-funded regulatory effort on them. Everybody else gets credit for doing it right first time progressively themselves. And then the question is, what is ethical business practice? How do you define as a regulator which companies are doing the right thing and which are not? It's a mixture of hard law obligations. What are your legal responsibilities? And what are your business purpose obligations, the accountability around ESGs? So that's a framing that says the incentive is, firstly, purpose, you know you've got to do it, otherwise you will fail as a company. Secondly, if you can show you're doing it, you get less visits from the regulator. And that then
Recording in progress.
To the third example, which is the Economics of Mutuality Foundation, EOM.org, just recently spun out of a decade-long Mars Incorporated adventure with the Oxford Saïd Business School. And it's a new foundation based in Geneva, I'm afraid, not Zurich, but Geneva, very close. And what they're saying is, if you look at human capital development, social community development, natural capital, and you make your business units accountable for those things and link the accountability to their bonuses, guess what? You can make a much more effective impact on the planet, as well as doing even better on the financials. And so the novelty there is to make that not just a CSR discourse, but something where the soft law is inside the company, and it's very hard because executive bonus depends on achievement. And you can see not only a company like Mars Incorporated now doing it, in their last sustainability report, Bayer, which is also quite a big company and is in the stock market, is now doing the same, making executive remuneration dependent on hitting ESG targets, which are seriously accountable down to the cost center. And I think if you put those three pillars together, you actually have grounds for optimism. And what are the grounds for pessimism? Human nature. We all default to what we've always done. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Robert. And you're right. I mean, it's with businesses, there is more and more pressure as well from not only regulator, but also expectations from the market. And this sustainable business practices will definitely relate to very many of these things that we are discussing now. So, and you have to be able to link the remuneration and incentive for the top management and the board with what really the requirements are on the market. Otherwise, it just doesn't work, because we have a very, very short term and the long term gap in the expectations and incentives. So that actually ties extremely well to my next question that will go to Karen. You work, Karen, with AI developers. We heard from Robert the examples of Mars and Bayer. Your work is also very much linked to advising boards and top management of tech companies. So how much emphasis is or should be put on the business case or business side in showcasing ethics by design as responsible practice, voluntary and proactively subject themselves to external scrutiny? We talked about audits, we talked about certification also in the previous panel, to ascertain their accountability. I'd also like to explore the role of such a focus, so the role that such focus plays actually in building a competitive advantage, strategic advantage for the business, where obviously exactly the short-term versus long-term view has to be taken into account. And that links very well to the comments that Robert just made. So Karen, please.
Well, thank you very much. And it was just a perfect segue. And so I appreciate the opportunity to be here and participate in this conversation. I'm moved by Robert's observation around human nature, and I think we need to sort of not lose track of that. I mean, and sort of the drive both towards competitiveness and also ethics sort of models, and both are at work, and not necessarily intention, right? And then I think there's a little bit over-indexed conversation on false choices that we set up. And so in my work, I really spend a lot of time trying to resist that temptation. And so one of the ways we do that is really actually starting with the competitive issue. And people come to the soft law question and the AI governance question from lots of different perspectives, of which ethics is one, and it's a really important one. Compliance with whatever rules are out there is one, and that's sort of I think of that not even as a minimum standards adherence, but issue, but it's really a mindset, and that's a completely understandable one. Produces a lot of frustration because it's really difficult to know what compliance means in this particular moment. But where we really start, and where I think it is a much more productive conversation, is on the strategy question, which is how does technology governance translate into business strategy, competitive strategy, market, positioning, and some of it boils down to customer trust, some of it boils down to brand and reputational issues. Some of it, quite honestly, is starting to boil down to return on investment, where you can really start to pencil it out. And I think, to my mind, that's a much more interesting conversation because it brings in a different set of stakeholders than maybe traditionally is engaged in the conversation if you're limiting it to a technology problem, to a compliance problem, to a legal problem. And it involves the developers as well as the users of the technology, even within one organization. So from my perspective, the ethics by design is a really important feature, but it's really it's a little bit adjacent to the broader question, which is that all of this governance by design stuff should be in the mix, and it should, and it is just most effective done at the beginning of a process than at the end of a process where you're trying to bolt on, incremental fixes. I think if it can get into the thinking at the front end, and if it can get into the incentive systems, as we were just discussing, at the front end, and it can get into the expectations at the front end, you just do better at it. And you have the opportunities to do the multi-stakeholder work, to do the really bespoke work of figuring out what rules, work for you in which contexts. And I'll say one more thing and then pause, which is that I often talk about these concepts the way we talk about nutritional guidelines, right? Where we all kind of know what a healthy diet looks like and should be, and we don't always adhere to that, but we kind of understand it. Totally different question than what you're making for dinner tomorrow night when 3 of your friends come over, right? One of whom is gluten-free and, on a budget, right? So it's that question about what we're making for dinner and what our context looks like and what our resources are and what we're trying to achieve that really needs to start to animate this conversation. And I think that's where the by design and sort of front end thinking can be very, very helpful. Mm-hmm. So I'll pause there, but that's sort of a brief tour around the way we are thinking about this in the work that we're doing.
Thank you so much, Karen. And I'm sure we're going to be circling back to the business incentives and the strategic orientation of the business in this panel, but also in the panel that will be on next day. So on how we actually incentivize SMEs and startups to be also responsibly innovating. So there is a lot of strategic thinking and positioning definitely there. And as you said, incentives are extremely important to use as a trust differentiators. I would like to turn now to Thomas and to Gerhard and then to Zhiyu to explore some of the national initiatives with regards to governance and maybe exactly the governance by design that we are talking here. representing Switzerland and China. I think we talk about a more a soft law than hard law at this stage. We've seen that certainly for Switzerland and mentioned in the previous panel. So Thomas, over to you. What I'd like to ask you is to give us a little bit of overview of a country where, which is viewed obviously as a business-friendly country. There is obviously a lot of experience with managing and governing the new technologies. So where is Switzerland there? How is it taking inspiration? Maybe what is happening in Europe and maybe globally? So what is next in the Swiss pipeline there?
Yes, thank you, Sanja. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Thank you, and hello, everybody. It's a pleasure for me to be here. And I've been also listening to some of the previous sessions, in particular the one just before. And with this also, I'd like to refer to some of what Judy Belage had said. She's a member of the Swiss Parliament. We have, with Gerhard, we have another one here. It is true that Switzerland has a, let's say, slightly different tradition than many of our neighboring countries, at least, that there is a strong conviction that you don't create laws unless they are necessary. And for instance, one example, there is no law regulating press or press freedom at all in Switzerland. Has never been. The only thing that we have is a line in the article that says, in the constitution, that says press freedom is guaranteed. But that does not mean that there are no rules for the press, for journalists, for how to behave, right to reply, and so on and so forth. First of all, there's a long tradition in self-regulation of the press, for instance, and then there are the general rules of our society, the general legal basis, human rights that apply, and the courts. There are lots of court cases that interpret and take balances, and so on. The same about radio television. The first radio and television law is from the early 90s in Switzerland, but that doesn't mean that we had no rules before that, because we've been having television also for of course many decades before. And with regard to AI, we have the government has undertaken an exercise to assess where we are with regard to AI. Try to understand what is happening. Try to understand where there is a necessity to look closer into things and maybe to act or to react. And the finding of that report that comprised all the departments of all the parts of our government was that basically the current legal bases that are there already cover to a largest extent the challenges that are related to AI. But at the same time, they decided that we should look closer into some of the issues. For instance, my office had got the task to look into what is the effect of the use of AI in the media, in public sphere, on debates, hate speech, incitement to violence, and so on and so forth. So we are currently looking into this, preparing a report for the government that proposes some further action. We are also, of course, looking at what is done in the EU, in other countries. We are participating in fora like the Council of Europe on developing soft and hard law in this area. And it's also true that we try not to regulate usually to the extent possible, not to regulate particular technology. But if I take the example of a knife that Judy Belage mentioned, there is no knife law. There she's right. But that doesn't mean that you can do with a knife anywhere at any time what you want in Switzerland. So there is regulation that in an airplane, you're not allowed to take a knife with you that exceeds a certain size, for instance, like all the other countries around us have to. So there is regulation, but it's meant to be more technology neutral, and it's more based on soft law, where people think that it is sufficient to place soft law. And we also have a difference compared to many of our European neighbors that in an approach that we try to regulate less ex ante, but first let things happen and see where do we actually have problems and then react to problems. So we are more, let's say, inclined to ex post regulation than ex ante, which is sometimes closer in our thinking. We are closer to the US sometimes than to France or other countries around us. And there's something similar is also happening now with AI. We have developed soft law regulation for the time being, that was also one of the tasks from that report, for the time being, only for government, for public actors, that they should take into account. And we have also agreed on the monitoring. So that regulation is that soft law regulation is from last year, and next year we are supposed to undertake a monitoring and then see whether this is enough or whether further measures are necessary. So this is usually the approach that we're taking. But if the fact that you do not immediately turn to creating laws does not mean that you are not watching things and you're not preparing, because if our view is normally that even if you think it's not yet time to act because it's not yet clear what actually is the goal of regulation or what may be consequences of regulation. And it was, by the way, quite interesting to hear about some side effects, if we call it that way, of the GDPR regulation that we've heard earlier this morning. So our aim is normally to be ready, to have studied things and to have clear ideas, so that when there is a wish by our people, by our stakeholders, that there should be a regulation, that we know what regulation should come. And in this context, it is also important to remember that because we are a direct democratic system, the government cannot, or the parliament cannot just propose a regulation. If some people think, or some stakeholders think, that it may go in the right direction, but some part of it is particularly wrong for them or bad for them, they will just collect signatures and start a referendum, and then there's a vote. And if the majority of the people says, yeah, basically this is a good thing, but it's not good enough, so they would just say no. So this is an additional burden that our direct democratic system puts on us, that we will only come up with a regulation or with a law if there's a strong signal that it actually will pass a majority of the people if it goes to a vote. And the final point, of course, is that knowing that we are a small country, we normally are very active in international fora and try not to create laws or specific rules for ourselves, but we try to shape the rules on the international level so that there are equal rules for everybody. So this is why we are actively participating in the OECD when it comes to soft law creation and standards on AI. We are participating in the current UNESCO efforts to come up with a global soft law instruments. And as you've mentioned, I personally am part of two Council of Europe standard setting committees. The one is more based on media and freedom of expression, and the other one is the CAHI, that is supposed to develop this basis for the Council of Europe negotiations on a binding instrument that may be accompanied with soft law elements next year, the CAHI, as Jan Kleisen has mentioned. So this is basically a short outline of how we work. And one important thing that I would tend to disagree with you, Belej, the fact that we do not have laws yet doesn't mean that there is no discussions. We have lots of channels. There are parliamentarian dinners with multi-stakeholder expert discussions. I participated in one in June on AI. We have a thing called Platform Tripartite on artificial intelligence where we're having discussions. And we also have the Swiss Internet Governance Forum, where also Gerhard participated, for instance, where we discuss things like this in order to help to sense where people want us to go. I'll stop here, and I'm happy to participate in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. And I think it's interesting. You mentioned actually the government. That goes back to what Carlos was saying with the soft law approach. Governments are apparently one of the biggest producers of those. So it's going to be interesting to observe how this, I wouldn't say experiment, how this element of introduction in Switzerland goes with the monitoring you mentioned. You also mentioned that, and this is a great segue into Gerhard's question for Gerhard, that there are obviously a lot of discussions on an ongoing basis, and there are different platforms. So Gerhard, we originally discussed about you having two hats. You are on one hand the business person, so the businessman who obviously has interest in certain type of freedom to innovate. You're also a representative in the Swiss Parliament, which obviously means that your role is there to be able to have an ear on the ground, understand what the expectations are from the population. We just heard from Thomas specificity of Switzerland with initiatives. So how do you combine all of that? And what do you hear actually from the business community that you're obviously very, very much tuned into in terms of the need and desire potentially to have a little bit stronger regulation, or to continue with what is happening now and more kind of observing but acting only when necessary?
Yeah, thank you so much. I hope you hear me.
Very well.
Okay, fine then. So thank you for inviting me to this panel. I mean, I learned so many things just 45 minutes I've been here with you. I mean, it's a huge topic, and the question you raised, like with these two hats, that's really something that's I'd say rather new to me, because now my concern is for the people, way more maybe I guess than before. Because if you're a business person, if you're in a sector, in an industry, you tend to have a rather narrow view. I had that myself, or maybe I still have it in some areas. And I think if you want to represent the people in a parliament, I mean, you have to integrate what you feel, what you sense, and that might not be the thing the industry wants right away. Because innovation, of course, it's a good thing. We should let things happen. But here with AI, I think we have some special new dynamics that we haven't seen in that speed, in that scale before. And it is already here. It already hurts, especially when I look at social media platforms. I mean, that's I guess the most common AI usage right now. And as I heard in the previous panel, I mean, where's the AI that is resolving all our issues? It's causing a lot of trouble, first of all. So that's something I have to deal with, and what I feel from the people, because like Thomas just said, we have a quite special system where people can say no, and there's going to be a vote, even though the government and even the parliament might support a law, might support a bill. There's still the option that the people is asking some serious questions, is going to collect some signatures, and we're going to vote. And I have always that in my mind, and I think it's a good thing. It's a good check, and it's a good way of doing checks and balances, because sometimes we can be also, I'd say, even the parliament, together with the government, together with some industry interests somehow outside of what people's realities are. So I think that's a good thing, but that's why most of all, I'm interested in what does that mean for people. So whatever approach we choose, is it soft law, is it hard law, is it mandatory self-regulation, a thing that Switzerland uses. I don't know if other countries use that as well. So you let the industry define how they want to regulate that thing, and the authorities only check, is that good enough? And usually that works quite well. So we have good tools to deal with these kinds of situations. Mm-hmm. But what I would like to really avoid is some sort of backlash, some sort of referendum where we're gonna ban AI usage, or where we're gonna be tough with what AI is, because like many things, like all things, it also AI comes in a pair. There's huge opportunities, but also come along huge risks, and we have to deal with that. And I think AI is quite special because of course we can apply traditional ways of dealing with this with regulation, but I think we have here I'd say a beast that is rather different than what we have seen up until now. And I'm not so sure if the industry should push as a whole for speed, because it's going to be fast anyway. So we don't have to accelerate. I think the industry could even have, if it's coordinated globally, okay, maybe that might be a little bit utopic, but it has an interest, the industry, that this whole thing doesn't explode. That's why it's so important to create trust by explaining, by open sourcing, like everything that's out there should be completely open sourced, like every line of it, so that that it can be challenged. Of course, the question might then be, how do we do business models with that? But the open source industry found ways to do so. So I think it's really, really important for this kind of technology that we, from very early on, try to be as transparent and as trustworthy as possible, because the risks are way too important that come along with this technology, that we can just ignore and let the industry push for speed, because speed might hurt on the long run. We have to actually civilize artificial intelligence, like we did with natural intelligence, by the way. So
exactly. I think it's a very good segue. Thanks a lot, Gerhard. And I'd like just to briefly move to Zhiyu as well, because I think it's a moment where we'd like to hear also from her experience. We're talking about speed. I think it's a great element to move now on for China. China doesn't seem to mind the speed. It's been a country that has obviously stimulated as a state the development and the speed. It is also a country that is very active in trying to work on the standards, national standards and international standards, and have their say. So very briefly, Zhiyu, to you, Chinese companies started early publishing the AI principles, and ever since are joined by the government and academia, and a lot of that was standards as well. Regulatory initiatives are also starting to emerge more and more. So where is the debate now, and how is it likely to move? Are we seeing a kind of a rolling progress, because obviously it's still as a huge objective for the government to be a leader in AI development globally and to assert that position. So how is this regulation potentially going to temper that? And where do we see potentially the opposite, where the influence on work with the global standards can actually promote that national competitiveness?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Sanja, for this great introduction. I mean, I have to say it's a pleasure to join the panel and discuss AI governance with other panelists. So speaking of AI governance in China, perhaps we can start with a quick overview of Chinese AI industry, okay? So in July 2017, the State Council of China issued a national guideline, the development plan for the new generation of artificial intelligence, which basically set out the three-step goal, aiming to make China a world leader in AI by 2030. So in China, AI technologies have been applied to all kinds of public and private affairs, including transport, healthcare, finance, education. So take legal industry as an example, okay? So a few years ago, China launched a smart court initiative to digitize its legal system. Today, pro se litigants can use AI-powered systems to generate their complaints, cross-examine key evidence in trial hearings, and predict the likelihood of winning a lawsuit. One may say, AI increased the access to justice. Yet, the general public and the judges themselves have limited knowledge of the case data sets used by these machines, as well as their filtering process of evidence. So therefore, on the other hand, inaccurate big data analysis or non-transparent data processing might deny justice. So of course, similar problems are likely to arise in other fields too. According to a survey fielded to over 3,000 Chinese citizens in 2017, one of the top 3 questions raised by the respondents about AI developments was, what harms would AI cause? So while there is certainly a national push for AI innovations, China has promulgated several statutes and regulations to tackle legal and ethical issues arising from AI systems. including the cybersecurity law, which came into effect in 2017, e-commerce law in 2019, and more recently, personal information protection law and the data security law. So for example, the data security law subjects companies or individuals who mishandled data to monetary penalties or criminal liability. The personal information protection law further requires whoever collects and handles personal data to conduct a risk assessment in advance, as well as to secure users' consent unless exemptions apply. Since then, quite a few AI-related lawsuits have been funneled into Chinese courts. If any of you are interested and we have time in the Q&A session, happy to share some of the high-profile cases with you. So now, soft law. So as Professor Gary Merchant previously illustrated, the pace of development of AI far exceeds the capacity of any traditional regulatory system to keep up. Facing the fast-moving AI industry in China, hard law might not be enough. There are demands for complementary approaches like soft law that can be created and updated on the go. According to the 2021 government-issued AI white paper, social groups and industry associations such as Computer User Association and Shenzhen AI Industry Association have published more than 15 sets of norms and specifications to standardize the development and application of AI technologies in relevant fields. Besides, tech giants and startups have been developing self-regulations and conduct codes to guide their own practices. A leading company focusing on machine learning, for example, MagV, also set up an ethical committee and an AI governance research institute with a focus on the appropriate use of AI technologies. At the international level, China started to play a more active role in engaging with global efforts in governing AI. It translated and summarized plenty of AI-related regulations set out by, for example, IEEE, NIST in the US and the European Union. In 2018, China also published an official white paper on in both Chinese and English.
You may have a problem listening to you. Can you put the mic down? We don't hear very well.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now?
No, it's better. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Maybe I put the mic too close to my.
And I'll have to ask you just to quickly finalize the comments because we still have some going further, and I'd like to open it also to the audience because there are some Q&A. So.
Sure. Then I'll just briefly talk about the final point. Okay. So in terms of future debate on AI development in China, I think some of them will arise from the tension between individual rights and collective interest. Given the Confucian roots of China, whether at what point individual rights such as privacy should give way to pursuing national or community interests. A notable example would be the implementation of AI-powered surveillance systems for national health concern. And I think more discussions will also possibly go to the enforcement of soft law, will and should China's AI governance become more decentralized, where private sectors can take the lead. So that's all. And thank you for the time and attention.
Thank you very much, Zhiyu. It's very good, again, a segue into understanding what Emelie and Marta are working on. They are both leading the development of the standards. I'd like to hear from them on what is the process actually to get stakeholder alignment. Here we have obviously a lot of people around the table. There are different objectives. There are potentially different stakes.
We're going to finish.
Whole thing. And
just bear with me.
Sorry.
Session.
So essentially what I'd like to ask first, Emelie, UK government has published this summer its innovation strategy, in which it called for standards development to uphold innovativeness and competitiveness of UK business. So there was a clear mandate. The government gave a mandate to NQI, the National quality infrastructure, of which BSI, so British Standard Institution, is a part, to come up with the standards for the fourth industrial revolution. So what are the key focus areas, and which challenges did you actually have to navigate to come up with them? And then I'd like to move to Marta with the global initiative for the AI management system of ISO. Emelie.
Thanks, everyone. I think it's been quite an interesting conversation so far. I'm representing BSI in this capacity, and the role of standards has been touched upon by pretty much everyone here. Effectively, where we see ourselves with the standards development community is that we represent industry and we look to solve specific problems relating to industry based on maturity, need for compliance, regulatory development, and the different stages that goes along with that. Now, standards are not really there to be a hindrance to innovation. It's not restrictive in any way in terms of design, in terms of development. In fact, one of the main purposes that we're supposed to be going into is to support the development, build trust, and ensure that there is flexibility for us to adapt different varying business models. AI is one of the key areas that's been emerging within the standards community that's truly more horizontal than many other that are seen in the scene. And that means that the language use needs to be adaptable to all sectors. The implementation of it needs to be validated in a way that is through common consensus. The international standards community has 50 countries involved. At UK level, we mentioned the involvement of SMEs. At UK level, we have over 70 participants, and SME builds up quite a large percentage of that because of the nature of AI industry and its developments and progression. Along with that, we have academia, consumer interest group, as well as government. And where that overlaps is obviously standards sits below legislation. Legislation needs to come first if there are any in existence, and standards are there to support it where possible. It certainly wouldn't be there to conflict against it. We're having some interesting conversations at European level as well, is that within the Sensenelec community, even though UK has exited from the European Commission, we are, BSI and the UK industry as a whole are very much still a participant within the standards community. So where potential conversations around harmonization of standards, where legislation and standards are truly interconnected with each other and has a cohesion that is really going to provide a better level of support and understanding and adoption for industry. We're still very much involved in that conversation, and we're very much a part of that process. And with that, the UK government is obviously a part of that conversation. So from our perspective, given the 70 plus members that we have on the national side for the UK, plus however many more within the 49 other countries involved in the standards development process, collectively we're forming a voice to say this is where industry feels regulation could help us. This is where we feel the support could lend a hand to. Standards obviously has its limitations in the sense that it is a voluntary model, and therefore it doesn't set values. One of the biggest questions that we get going into AI conversations is, well, how do you tackle the issue of ethics? How do you build up the value frameworks? Like, well, actually standards doesn't do that for you. A community, whether it be a government or a region, would set those values for themselves. And where we come in is to provide that level of trust and maturity and support to say, this is where we think a base level of operation could be. If we all buy into it, it encourages consumer trust. If we buy into it, it allows innovation to grow into a safer space. So that's hopefully where standards is going to play a key role, be it a part of the soft law process or take on a more active role in terms of having more harmonized standards to support legislation in a more real way.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Emelie. And interesting segue to Marta, because you work essentially on ISO, AI management system. And obviously, Emelie was talking about integration of some of that or coordination. She also talked about a need to understand where people are coming from. How much of the objectives are there from the outset to actually get everybody on board and make sure that we progress? Is this a hindering speed? Are we talking about compromises? How do we work with these national, international requirements and mandates and so many people around the table to be able to still produce something which is going to be useful, ultimately integrated in the legal framework of a hard law? Because obviously we'll have to make sure that there is some compliance and that there is some certification as well, oversight bodies. So can you take us a little bit through how did you essentially manage to navigate that for the ISO 42001?
Yes, absolutely. I just apologize. I will not be on video as my connection seems to be wavering over the course of this panel. But I think it's there's of course challenges and opportunities of being able to bring together so many different countries. And just to give maybe a bit of clarity for those that aren't familiar, when we look at ISO standards, they're participation by country, but each country's mirror committee and the participants around the table are expected to be diverse. So as much as we sometimes like to shorthand what we're looking for from industry, from government, from academia, and basically representing that sector, that subject matter, as it appears in that country. So it hopefully has a well-represented opportunity for them to come to the table. And so the way this really works is that the national position can be formed amongst those diverse voices and be able to bring then sorry, I apologize in the background. Basically what happens is it gives a very interesting perspective around the table, because while each country may be a little bit different, come from a different either matrix style of whether maybe some are more industry of larger industries, some are more startup or scale up structure, depending on the economics, what type of R&D the country is looking at or has particular interest in. It comes through in sort of a, I like to say like a quilt almost, because it picks up on different commonalities from the other national committees. And so in particular, when we look at the AI committee, it's formed between ISO and IEC as a joint technical committee for AI specifically. And as it's been mentioned, we have about 50 countries that are participating since 2017. So we've had a few years to get up and running, and there are quite a number of standards that are under development. And due to its international role and due to the fact that there is such a wide diversity of interests, there are very diverse standards that fall into the scope that are being developed, such as concepts and terminology, foundations, risk management, governance, and of course, as mentioned, the management system standard. And I think what's particularly interesting here is that we have the advantage of relying on a long history of providing standards that are used both by industry and regulators to help set that direction. And there's a common language around compliance guidance, what to expect out of an ISO standard, out of an IEC technical specification, how those audits are created, how compliance conformity assessment is created. So in particularly when we're looking at a new area with many questions, at least having that familiarity of that type of process. There is a process by which means experts can write up their contributions, present them. We have the ability to do it in different time zones to accommodate for full participation. Used to have 2 plenaries in person. And this is, I think, extremely important for us because, as mentioned before, some of these areas around questions of ethics or bias and being able to get consensus around the table. The idea here is to be able to exchange those ideas as freely and engage in the subject matter discussion. And at the end of the day, to be able to provide that text that is most reflective of the consensus in the room. And so we've been able to do this in particular around the standard that I'm the project editor for, the AI management system standard. We are leveraging a very well-established structure. Management system standards have been used, and the success stories of that structure can be found in many other sectors where we do have that already existing relationship between soft law and regulations and standards and regulations. ISO 13485 for medical devices, very well documented. We have ISO 14000 family, which is for environmental management. We have ISO 27001 for information security management. So we've seen this work. And we find that for AI, it provides the at least ground zero or foundation for providing a document with those controls and requirements and implementation guidance for those controls. What are the individual controls? Well, that is where we have those discussions and we have those contributions come to the table from all the countries that are participating. So of course, really important that we keep advocating for participation. We've been really happy that regulators have increased their participation in ISO standard development, particularly in AI over the past year by about 60%. This is very encouraging because we are seeing that relationship with regulators and ISO standards come really close. In particular, with the EU draft regulations, we've noticed a lot more uptake with EU countries sending their regulators and being really actively involved. I would direct the listeners to the paper that was put out by the EU Observatory for ICT Standardization. They're part of Stand ICT, and they did a comprehensive mapping showing how these ISO standards would map against the draft regulations and what kind of tool, what would be the outcome for their use. And it's quite promising. Of course, this is still very much in motion, and there are many standards that are being developed.
Thank you so much, Marta. I think it's great. Essentially, what you mentioned about the consultation and making sure that there is actually a link already with some of the regulatory frameworks that are being proposed. There was a lot of commentary in the chat. Some of the questions have been answered already by panelists in the chat, but I'd like to ask Pavlina to summarize and maybe select a couple that haven't, that could be of interest for everybody. So Pavlina, over to you.
Hello, everybody. So yes, indeed, we had a very lively discussion in the chat about the impact of AI, either intentional or non-intentional, on a society, either harmful or beneficial, used by state or by companies. I do have 2 questions for the panelists. One is from Hillary, which was partly answered by Robert, but maybe Carlos would like to also chime in on this one. Hillary is familiar with Chris Hodges' work on what she understands the so-called conduct and culture regulation, increasingly being used in the finance sector. Are there any specific examples of this in AI or anywhere else which have actually worked in effectively shaping companies' behavior we could look at? And a second question from Deborah, which was also partly discussed in the chat, but maybe panelists would like to chime in, is what can we do to tackle situations where executives choosing what AI to implement make bad choices because they don't know what questions to ask and how to discern what's real and what's fluff or hype? She gives an example of a platform telling companies they could help them decide which employees are sick or not in the COVID times, which of course infringed on the employees' rights. So far, that's it from the chat, and I'm looking forward to the answers. Thank you. Very good. Thank you very much, Pavlina. So maybe we indeed go first to Carlos. Any comment on the examples of the effective examples of where the culture actually is addressed, and how could that potentially be helped with some incentives?
There you go. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I think there's a couple of places where AI has been used, not only for culture, but for reasons that have fiduciary responsibility, such as in Hillary's question, she mentions finance, and a big sector that is getting a push in the financial sector is robo-advisors. The idea of having the financial wherewithal of individuals being advised by not humans, but by algorithms that determine where is the best allocation of the market. Now, the interesting thing here is, who are these AI algorithms loyal to? So are these algorithms loyal to the companies that are providing these services? So is there some sort of incentive that is working, that if this product is sold, a better commission is obtained, or if that one, a lower commission, so it's a commission play? Or is there loyalty to the consumer, where in effect the best interest of the consumer is at hand and is protected? So loyalty is a very important thing in areas where fiduciary responsibility is considered. Another area is medicine. We will eventually come into a future where medical devices will not only provide us with the statistics of our heartbeats, but may also provide us with the diagnosis and prognosis and treatment for how individuals or patients should be, or diseases should be treated. If we reach that scenario, and thinking about culture and going a little bit outside of it and thinking about loyalty, who are those AI systems loyal to? If the AI system is loyal to the hospital, and in the United States, hospital systems are, many of them are for profit, then they might think, well, how do we keep the patient in the hospital for the longest time possible to maximize our profits? If it's loyal to a doctor, then it can think, okay, what is a treatment I can provide that can minimize my liability to the patient? If it's loyal to a consumer or to a patient, it might think, okay, how do I get the patient out of a hospital and treat them as fastly and as efficiently as possible? So these are examples of how different loyalties and different cultures of a business can influence the output of what happens in an algorithmic system. And I forgot what the second question was. I'm so sorry. I know that Hillary had the first one, and
the question was from Deborah about bad choices of people who are, I think, buying AI. So they're not developers. Obviously, they're there out of the market. And ultimately, how can we reconcile the fact that very often these choices can actually increase the risk, the safety issues, and I guess ultimately the liabilities.
Yeah, there's unfortunately there's many examples of this, and I don't think there's a really easy solution for it other than trying to lower the asymmetry of information. You know, one of the most unfortunate examples happens in the United States with facial recognition technology in school systems trying to avoid or prevent school shootings. Unfortunately, many school systems in the United States, they're controlled at the local level, have spent millions of dollars in facial recognition systems to identify individuals that are not supposed to be in a school campus. Unfortunately, the reality of the decision-making of this is that most school shootings are performed by individuals that are supposed to be there. So this includes students or individuals that work in a facility. And millions of dollars have been spent to try to help these situations, but they're being spent wrongly, as the example for COVID of trying to identify individuals that maybe cough or maybe asymptomatic. So I don't think there's a readily available answer. I think what soft law does provide is, because institutions or organizations can create their soft law at any point in time, we can kind of identify which best practices do function for a particular subject area, such as maybe COVID identification or maybe school shooting prevention. These standards, these guidelines can be shared amongst individuals to diminish the asymmetries that exist with, okay, how do we solve this problem, and help institutions invest their resources correctly and not throw their money away as many have.
Mm-hmm. I'd like maybe to turn that question both to Karen and then to Robert. Karen, we obviously talked about AI developers, and obviously here we talk about those who are developing systems and put them on the market. if you talk about the supply chain, if you talk about the value chain creation, if you talk about incentives to actually be transparent, to make sure that everybody who is buying these systems knows what they're buying, and that all the risk management, and we were talking about the ecosystem of risk management in the previous panel, and how much it's actually needed to be able to ensure that certain things just don't happen. So can we, I mean, what would be your view? What would be actually the need on the AI developer side before they are putting things on the market, and then support their customers within the value chain?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different issues here. One is that I actually think the quality procurement question is answerable, right? We most sophisticated organizations know how to diligence product, and the fact that they aren't doing it here or don't do a good enough job at it is something that we can improve on, right? That there are processes for this, there are checklists for this, there are resources for this. And one concern is that, first of all, the diligence team tends to be siloed over in the technology department, which is not necessarily where, to your point, the users of the technology reside. And so when I was speaking earlier about multi-stakeholder teams and the need to bring in teams more as a strategy, I think this is one good example where, you know, procurement protocol and process needs to have a wider lens, include sort of a broader range of people within an organization. And there need to be permission structures for asking what may seem like dumb questions, right? Which is, what does this tool do? Why do we need it? What is the use case? Who trained it? I mean, there's a whole list of questions we can, you know, if we had time, we could come up with today. That exists. And I'm confident that, Carlos, your resource is full of those checklists. There's a different problem on the supplier side, and they've got a couple different problems. One is they've got, in certain applications, pretty intense know your customer questions and issues to resolve, which are, from my perspective, pretty untreated at this point. Meaning, if I'm putting AI out in the world and I know I'm selling it to customers A, B, and C, what are my obligations to understand how customers A, B, and C are using it, how ethically they're using it, frankly, that they're using it for the purposes it was developed, as opposed to some other purpose they might develop, you know, strike upon later. So there's that whole area of inquiry is a pretty interesting one, and I think underdeveloped. The other issue is just where you've got people out selling software who don't understand, and tools who don't understand how it works or what it does, right? That it's not being marketed and sold necessarily by the same team of people who developed it, and there is, let's just say, inflation sometimes in how its capabilities get expressed. That begs a different set of solutions around truth and advertising, and making sure that there's core competency in the sales force. And you know, that is something, again, that I think we sort of know how to solve that problem. We just haven't really focused on it in this domain right now. And we haven't visited, you know, frankly, loud enough consequences on companies that abuse that conversation. But this actually strikes me as an area where we know how to do this, right? We just have to dedicate ourselves to doing it intelligently as it relates to these tools that I think do have special dimensions and special consequences. And I really think, you know, it's the ability of these tools to sort of their velocity and impact are two of the things that really differentiate them from ordinary technologies that might be purchased into an organization. And because of those two features, we just need to think about it more broadly and bring some of that learning and proven process. And some of it's risk management, some of it's strategic. So I'll stop there, but this is an area where I think we've got plenty of work to do if we just sit down to do it.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, thank you. And I think it does also link to an ecosystem of risk management, and how do we make sure that we have the right people around the table who can then contribute with some of these solutions that can be applied to many actors. And this is what I'd like to turn to you, Robert. I mean, you talked about coordination efforts and coordination mechanisms that, you know, a well-conceived toolbox for a good European AI governance should contain. We can certainly go beyond European references here, but this risk management really, where obviously we talk about also oversight agencies, potentially regulatory sandboxes to learn more, to be able to understand where this moves and how we can help out. So how can we help companies to innovate better? How can we make sure that those who are buying the systems are reassured, because there is a certification, there is a constant learning, there are bells and checks and, you know, balances that are in the system, which obviously are part of the complete framework, but that do make this risk ticking box, if I can call it that way. But obviously, it's never going to be ticked forever, because it's going to be such an evolving thing. But where is this ecosystem then playing into that, and how we can best use it to reassure that we're doing well?
So I think Sanja, the answer is all around people. So firstly, there's a very interesting, I think, paradigm of so-called responsible innovation. And the underlying insight there, there's a lot of books you can read about it, is that the less you understand about the impacts of an emerging technology, the more you need the ordinary man and woman in the street to be directly engaging with the process of innovation. Because contrary to the sort of assumption by people like us that they won't understand, they will ask the questions. If you give them the license to come into the room, it fixes Karen's point about, can we have a license to ask the obvious questions? So that would be one piece. And when I go and talk to innovators and I say, you know, have you been out to the primary school I walked past in the street as I came to your building? They said, oh yeah, our PR department does that. The startups I would much rather invest in have the CEO who goes to a different primary school around his area once a week, because he comes back with bright ideas. So focusing on real people. And if you look at specific examples, Finland has made a huge push to ensure that everybody gets basic AI knowledge and training. That's really interesting. That's how you fix a society. And if I stay in the Nordic countries, in Norway, you can, this is not AI, but it's about innovation readiness. In Norway, you can just opt out of digital government. In Denmark, you can't unless you have a doctor's certificate. And I asked the Danes, how is it that, you know, you're sort of socially friendly people, how is it that you can be so draconian with your oldies? And they say it's because we trust government also to provide the drop-in centres and help to make it work for them. In other words, you know, we may all be missing the point when we think about this as an elite agency challenge. It may also critically be about a bit more funding for basic AI bootstrapping training in all society, a bit more encouragement to consumer organizations, and then definitely, I think, you know, things like IEEE standards for procurement and not just for consumer safety and ethics.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, thank you so much. And you brought IEEE. Obviously, we have Carlos, who is also having this hat of being part of IEEE efforts and making sure that these efforts are also being recognized and taking into account when we interact with global regulators. So maybe Carlos, and here I think Carlos, Marta, and Emelie, the three of you are involved in building national international standards for AI. So Emelie, at UK level, you explained how much you are getting coordinated with European standards body. Marta and Carlos, at the international level, you have these two major AI standardization initiatives, ISO and IEEE. So how do you coordinate and amplify the synergies ultimately? Because obviously the focus areas can be different and are different, but synergies or best practices on what has been learned from the input from the stakeholders base that you described, that you're working with, and how what are the challenges in the way of working on a parallel development of international standards? So what can we potentially collectively do better including the regulators acting?
Sure, I'm happy to jump in first. And just there's so many different opportunities for synergy. For example, between IEEE and the ISO-IEC Committee on AI, SC42, there's actually a standing liaison, an exchange of information based on what kind of standards are upcoming. There's clear transparency. Many of the experts that work on ISO standards work on IEEE standards. There is a difference in membership, of course, where with IEEE it's individual based, whereas within ISO-IEC it's national. Each of the national bodies has the opportunity to discuss with each other. So in my past role within the Standards Council of Canada, we had really great relationships with our equivalents in the UK, BSI, and this was something that we had the opportunity to engage in, particularly on any topics of interest, and this was reciprocated with other national bodies. So there are national level, sort of tangential to the actual standards organizations where there's opportunities for exchanges, as well as the organizations themselves that coordinate around making sure that the scopes are tangential and complementary. And so far, 4 years in, we've been successful in mitigating any overlap and being able to also help share the burden of having so many different standards requests amongst the different organizations. So it's actually quite well positioned.
Thank you, Marta.
I could probably fill in on some of the national perspectives on how that happens. So it is a very much collaborative effort. You can't really do it on your own. Having said that, every country has its own challenges and remits of expertise that they're looking to source. In terms of where we started off, having been on the circuit as a standards development body for a long time, AI was still a relatively new subject area to us. It took us a little while to reach out to all the relevant expertise and liaison groups. So we mirrored a lot of the conversations that were happening at international level. So where subjects came up around either medical devices or knowledge management or other committees that fall under the scene, we would also establish national liaisons at our level to make sure that we had as many contributions of feed-ins as possible. And it's taken us a few years to build up to the current portfolio of over 70 experts. And whenever there's new developments, we would also engage in recruitment activities to make sure that the topic area is covered if we do have the knowledge base to do so. But also vice versa, it's important for individual national bodies to consider what the areas of priorities are. So we have the benefit, I suppose, within the European community to build a bit more of a common voice because there's a platform to facilitate that conversation, and there are bespoke roadmaps and discussions in place to sort of help us guide that conversation a little bit and to have that steer on the international scene as well. In terms of where the challenges has been is also to know when to standardize what. And it's often the call to get validation of what is trustworthy, and within the standard space, certification schemes is probably the one that comes to mind the most, especially if you're talking about any kind of legal recognition in terms of contract negotiations, insurance, etc. So the development of standards like the management system work that's in place and things like the governance of AI systems work are standards that could fall under that scheme that would help support or at least pave the way for future conversations around regulatory support. In addition to that, I think in the UK, we are very aware of our political position that we're not a part of the Commission anymore. So even though the standards community may still respond to European directives, we at BSI still have the obligation to adhere and fall in line with what the UK governments are doing. So we're doing more additional outreach in terms of seeking regulatory support, having more open conversations with government bodies. We're also inviting, the AG15 under JTC1, which is a group bespokely set up to have standards outreach with legislators and policymakers to make sure that there isn't conflict in the discussions that are happening around the digital space, emerging tech, and any specific subject area as well. So we're doing more active outreach at UK level to sort of fill in some of the gaps in conversation and the peculiar place that we now find ourselves in.
Thank you very much. In the interest of time, Carlos, very, very briefly from you.
No, I just wanted to mention that the main difference with IEEE is that it is a professional association, which means that instead of national governments being directly participating in the creation of these standards, it is its members, individuals that can be either experts in a particular private sector or nonprofits or governments that participate individually. And we have incredible flexibility in creating standards either through the P7000 model or through other methods to address issues that need to be solved. So I don't want to go further because Marta and my other panelist, Emelie, did a great job in answering that question.
Thank you so much. I'm afraid we'll have to stop there, but I think this is a compelling topic that will keep coming back, that we will have to endorse and continue seeing first how to synergize on some of these developments that actually are on the national, supranational, and global level, make sure that they find ways into the legal framework, find a ways to link the ecosystem of risk management, make sure that the businesses have the right incentives. I think we touched on so many topics that will in itself command at least 1.5 hour panel on digging deeper into that. So thank you so much to the panelists. Thank all of you to be able to that were sharing all your insights. Thomas, Robert, Carlos, Emelie, Marta, Karen, Gerhard, and Zhiyu. We'll certainly be coming back and circling back to you for more insights before we actually prepare our follow-up event takeaway publication that we'll be sharing with the audience.